In the spring of 2003, every grain farmer in Lac-Saint-Jean County grew canola the same way. This was not a choice. It was the landscape itself. Canola was what the flat clay country north of the Saguenay did, the way the river ran south toward the Gulf. Not because anyone had decided it, but because nobody had stood still long enough to imagine anything else. The soil out there was heavy and gray, and it had been growing canola and barley in rotation since before most of the men working it had been born, and the men who farmed it were the sons of men who had farmed it, and their grandfathers before them. And the idea that any one of them might do something fundamentally different with that ground was not a radical idea. It was not even an idea, it was simply a thing that did not exist. The Bouchard farm sat on 520 acres just east of the Mistassini River, and it had been in the family since 1938. Hormedes Bouchard had cleared the original 80 acres himself with a horse team and a stubbornness that the county still talked about 60 years later. His son had added to it. His son's son had added to it again. By the time Réal Bouchard took over in 1979, it was a serious operation. The kind of farm that meant something in a county where farms meant everything. Réal had run it the way his father had. Canola in spring, barley in rotation, synthetic nitrogen in the fall. Repeat. He was not a careless man. He kept a blue ledger book and knew his per-acre yields going back 25 years. He produced clean grain and sold it to the elevator in Dobo Mistassini. He paid his debts, drove a truck that was 12 years old, and did not spend money on things that were not necessary. He did not ask whether there was a better way to farm the land. The way he was farming it was working. His daughter Marlène was 47 years old in the spring of 2003, and she had come back to the farm 6 years earlier after her marriage ended, and she found herself with 2 teenagers and a master's degree in soil science from Université Laval that she had never quite finished using. Let me tell you about Marlène Bouchard, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is not what you might expect. She was not young, she was not idealistic in the way young people are idealistic, with the clean certainty of someone who has never had to pay a heating bill. She was 41 years old when she moved back into her childhood bedroom with her son and daughter, driving a car with a cracked windshield and a folder of research papers she had been accumulating for years in a filing cabinet in her apartment in Quebec City. She had been working as a soil analyst for an agricultural consulting firm for most of her career. She had tested hundreds of fields across the province. She had written reports that farmers filed away and forgot, and she had, over those 16 years, developed a very specific and uncomfortable understanding of what was happening to the grain soils of Lac-Saint-Jean. She did not announce this understanding when she moved home. She helped with harvest. She cooked dinner. She fixed the fence line along the north field that had been leaning since the ice storm of 1998. She watched her father check the blue ledger book every evening after supper with the careful attention of a man who trusts only what he has measured himself. It was a Tuesday in late March of 2003 when she finally brought it up. She waited until after dinner, the way she had learned over 47 years that Réal Bouchard was a more patient man when his stomach was full and his coffee was hot. She put the folder on the table next to his cup and she said, "I want to show you something." He looked at the folder. He looked at his daughter. He said, "What kind of something?" She had the soil test results from their own fields, results she had arranged quietly through the extension office the previous fall, paying for them herself, telling no one. She spread them on the table next to a study from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada on biological nitrogen cycling in heavy clay soils and a paper from the University of Manitoba on cover crop interseeding in short-season grain systems, and she explained it the way she would have explained it to a client. Réal's fields were testing at 1.9% organic matter. In 1980, the provincial average for their soil type had been 3.1%. In 23 years of continuous canola-barley rotation with fall mold board plowing, the Bouchard farm had lost more than a third of its soil carbon, not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly, one season at a time. The way a savings account drains when you spend slightly more than you earn every month for 20 years and never look at the balance. Let me tell you about what that number means, because the number matters more than almost anything else in this story. Soil organic matter is not decoration. It is not a quality of good soil the way color is a quality of good paint. It is the soil's working capital. Every percentage point of organic matter in the top 12 inches of a field contains roughly 1,000 pounds of nitrogen, 100 pounds of phosphorus, and enough microbial activity to cycle those nutrients into plant-available form across an entire growing season. A field at 3% organic matter holds approximately 60,000 gallons of water per acre in the root zone. A field at 1.9% holds roughly 35,000. In a dry July on heavy clay in Lac-Saint-Jean, that difference is not a technical abstraction. That difference is whether your canola pollinates or fails. Real's fields had been producing 38 bushels of canola per acre, which was acceptable for that part of the province, but the input costs had been climbing steadily for a decade. Nitrogen applications that had cost $28 per acre in 1990 were costing $47 in 2003, and the yields had not moved. The soil was not responding to inputs the way it had. It was working harder to produce the same result, the way a person works harder to stay warm as they get older, burning more fuel for the same body temperature. Marlène had a proposal. She wanted to interseed a cover crop mixture into the standing barley in late summer. Crimson clover, tillage radish, and winter rye seeded at the flag leaf stage of the barley, before the canopy closed completely, establishing a living understory that would grow through harvest and into the fall, fixing nitrogen, breaking up the clay subsoil with root biomass, and building organic matter that would be incorporated the following spring. The per-acre seed cost was $11.40. The kitchen went quiet. Outside, the Mistassini River was still running under ice. Real picked up the Agriculture Canada paper and looked at it for a moment. He set it down. He looked at the soil test numbers again. "You want to plant something in the barley," he said finally, "after flag leaf. The crop is established. There's no competition for light during grain fill. The cover comes up under the canopy, in a barley field." "Yes." He was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Then he said, "I'll think about it." He thought about it for 5 days. On the 6th day, he came in from the equipment shed and said, "You can try it on the east quarter." Not the whole farm, the east quarter, which was the 130 acres along the river that had always been the most difficult ground they farmed. Wet in spring, compacted in summer, the field that never quite delivered what the inputs should have produced. "If it makes a mess of the barley harvest," he said, "we stop." Marlène said that was fair. Let me tell you about what happened at the Cooperative Agricole in Dolbeau, Mistassini, the following Saturday morning, because that is the moment this story turns, and you need to understand the room before you can understand what was said in it. The co-op on a Saturday morning in early April was a specific kind of institution. It was where the grain farmers of the county gathered before the week's work, drank coffee from a machine near the seed display, and talked about fuel prices and frost dates and what the wheat board was likely to do with the basis. The man who anchored that room most Saturday mornings was a fellow named Gervais Tanguay. Gervais ran the largest custom seeding and spraying operation in the county. He had been farming 1,100 acres himself and contracting another 800 for 20 years. And he had opinions about every field in his territory and most of the people who worked them. He was not an unkind man, he was a confident man. a man who had built a successful business on knowing exactly what Lac-Saint-Jean grain soils needed, and knowing that what they needed was the program he had been running since 1985. He was 58 years old, and he had never had a bad year that a good price recovery hadn't eventually fixed. Marlène had stopped at the co-op to pick up a soil pH meter she had ordered. She was not there to discuss her plans. But Gervais Tanguay was at the counter when she walked in, and he had heard something from someone at the elevator because that is the way small counties work. And he said, loudly enough for the room to hear, "Marlène Bouchard, I hear you're going to plant a salad mix in your father's barley." She told him what she was doing, exactly and technically. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then Gervais Tanguay started laughing. Not a complicated laugh. Not a laugh with any reflection behind it. The laugh of a man who has heard something that conflicts with everything he believes and has decided, without thinking about it for even a moment, that the thing itself must be wrong. Have you ever heard that laugh? Not a laugh of genuine amusement, not a laugh of surprise, but a laugh that functions as a wall. The sound a person produces when an idea arrives that they are not willing to examine, and the only instrument they have for handling it is to make the person carrying the idea feel foolish for having brought it. That was the laugh Gervais Tanguay produced in the Cooperative Agricole in Dolbeau Mistassini on that April morning. He wiped his eye and said, "That's heavy clay country, Marlène. You plant a cover crop in a standing grain crop. On heavy clay, you're going to have a nightmare at harvest. The roots will foul the header. You'll lose yield trying to cut through a mat of greenery," she said. "The rye winter kills before cutting. The radish breaks down in the fall. The clover is shallow-rooted. There's no fouling at normal cutting height." He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has learned the theory but not the practice. "Your father know about this?" "He gave me the East Quarter." Gervais shook his head. He said, "The East Quarter." "All right. Well, that's the ground nobody can figure out anyway. Maybe a salad crop is what it deserves." 1 or 2 of the men near the coffee machine smiled at that. The rest looked at their cups. Marlène picked up her pH meter and walked out. She did not argue. She did not explain further. She got in the truck and drove home, and she prepared her seeding plan. Let me tell you about the seeding, because the details are the proof. Marlène interseeded the cover crop mixture at the barley's flag leaf stage, which is the point at which the plant's final leaf has fully emerged and grain fill is beginning. The canopy at that stage is open enough to let light through to the soil surface for germination, while being established enough that the grain itself is past the point of competition. She used a modified broadcast spreader mounted on an ATV, calibrated to deliver 6.5 kilograms per acre of the trispecies mix across the full 130 acres of the East Quarter in 2 passes over a single afternoon. The cover crops germinated within 12 days. By the time the barley was approaching maturity in late August, a low green carpet of clover and emerging radish rosettes was visible between the rows, growing in the partial shade beneath the grain canopy. Quiet, unspectacular, doing nothing visible. That was the thing about what Marlène was doing. The biology she was trying to restore was happening where no one could see it, in the top 8 inches of clay soil, in a network of root channels and fungal threads and bacterial colonies working in the dark. Gervais Tanguay could drive past the East Quarter on the county road and see nothing unusual. Just barley, just a regular field in a regular August in Lac-Saint-Jean. The barley came off at 67 bushels per acre on the cover crop ground. The rest of the farm had averaged 71. The East Quarter had averaged 58 the year before. So 67 was a real improvement, but it was modest. Marlène wrote it in her notebook, a red hardcover field notebook she had been keeping for 6 years at that point. She recorded the cover crop stand going into September. "Dense and even," she wrote. radish establishing well, rye germinating at the edges. She noted the date of the first hard frost, which killed the clover and the radish tops and left a thick mat of decaying plant material across the soil's surface, the radish roots remaining in the ground to decompose slowly through the winter, leaving behind a network of channels in the clay that had not existed the previous spring. Gervais Tanguay heard the yield number from someone at the elevator and said to no one in particular that 67 bushels on the east quarter was probably just a lighter crop year and less waterlogging than usual, that the cover crop had nothing to do with it. Real did not say anything about expanding the trial, but he did not tell her to stop. Let me tell you about the spring of 2004, because that is when the numbers began to speak for themselves. Marlène drove back to the farm from Quebec City in April with a set of spring soil tests she had expedited through a private lab in St. Foy. The east quarter had tested at 2.2% organic matter, up from 1.9 the previous fall. The rest of the farm was still at 1.9. That difference represented, in practical terms, an additional 9,000 gallons of plant-available water per acre in the root zone. It represented a potential nitrogen credit of 25 to 35 pounds per acre from the decomposing clover residue alone, before any synthetic input was applied. She also had the water infiltration data she had been collecting with a simple double-ring infiltrometer she had borrowed from the extension office. The east quarter absorbed water at 1.8 centimeters per hour. The adjacent canola ground, no cover crop, absorbed water at 0.6 centimeters per hour. She wrote that number down and drew a line under it. She brought all of it to the kitchen table after dinner. Real looked at the soil tests for a long time. 1 year, he said. 1 year, she agreed, but the direction is right. He thought about it. He did not say he would think about it. He looked at the numbers and he thought about them right there at the table. Then he said, "You can do the river quarter and the north block." That was an additional 200 acres. She planted cover crops on all of it. She also reduced the synthetic nitrogen application on the east quarter by 30 pounds per acre, crediting the clover residue for the difference. The canola that went in on the east quarter that spring produced 40.5 bushels per acre. The farm's conventionally managed fields produced 37.5. The nitrogen cost savings on the east quarter were $14.10 per acre. On 130 acres, that was $1,833 in a year when input costs were rising faster than prices. Real looked at that number in the blue ledger book for a while. Then he looked at the red field notebook. Then he said, "You want to do the whole farm? All 520 acres, yes." He did not say he would think about it. He said, "You decide the program. You tell me what you need." Let me tell you about the summer of 2005, because the province was about to provide a demonstration that no research paper could have designed more precisely. The summer of 2005 was one of the driest in recorded history for the Saguenay Lac-Saint-Jean region. The snowpack the previous winter had been thin, and the spring runoff had been fast, and by June the soil moisture deficit across the region was already severe. July brought heat that the area had not seen since the early 1990s and rainfall that was 60% below normal. The canola that was flowering in early July across the county was doing it under conditions that pushed the crop directly to the edge of what it could survive. Pollination under heat stress. Root systems reaching for water that was not there. By the third week of July, the Quebec Ministry of Agriculture was tracking the situation closely. The preliminary projections for the region's canola crop were 22 to 26 bushels per acre. For a county where 38 bushels was the normal expectation, that was not a poor year. That was a year that would close operations. In the municipality of Mistassini, the situation followed the same pattern as everywhere else. Fields that had been planted into conventionally managed soil, plowed in fall, Low organic matter, no residue cover were showing the classic drought stress signatures by the second week of July. Leaf rolling in the afternoon heat, premature pod ripening, calyx filling thin. Gervais Tanguay drove his territory that summer and watched it happen across 1,800 acres of ground he knew like his own kitchen. He had applied every recommended input at the recommended rate. His nitrogen was in the ground, his fungicide timing had been right, his seeding rates were correct, and his crops were failing at the same rate as everyone else's, because inputs cannot replace water that is not in the soil. The Bouchard Farm's East Quarter, the ground that had now had 3 years of cover crop interseeding, was not having a good summer. Let me be clear about that. In a drought like the summer of 2005, no unirrigated crop in the region was having a good summer, but the East Quarter was responding differently. The organic matter that had climbed from 1.9 to 2.6% on the East Quarter over 3 seasons was holding water in the clay that would otherwise have been lost to evaporation. The root channels left behind by 3 seasons of decomposing radishes had created drainage pathways in the heavy clay that ran both directions, drawing water down from the surface during rain events and allowing capillary rise from deeper layers during dry periods. The cover crop residue on the soil surface was reducing evaporative loss by a measurable amount. Marlène had read the research. She understood the mechanisms. She had been measuring the infiltration rates and the organic matter levels and the soil temperature differentials for 3 years. But understanding a mechanism is not the same as standing in a field in July and watching it work. The East Quarter canola pollinated, not perfectly, not in the way it pollinated in a year with adequate moisture. But the calyx were filling. The plants had found water in a subsoil that had been rebuilt to hold it. The East Quarter came in at 34 bushels per acre in the fall of 2005. The county averaged 24. The Bouchard Farm's conventionally managed acres, which had only had 1 or 2 seasons of the cover crop program, came in at 29 bushels per acre, still above county average, still better than the fields around them, but the East Quarter, 3 years of covers, 3 years of reduced tillage, 3 years of organic matter accumulation, had outperformed the county average by 10 bushels per acre in one of the worst drought seasons in a generation. Marlène did the calculation on a separate page of the red notebook. At the fall 2005 canola price of $9.40 per bushel, the East Quarter had generated $319.60 per acre. The county average ground at 24 bushels had generated $225.60 per acre. The difference was $94 per acre. On 130 acres, that was $12,220 in a year, when a significant portion of the county's grain farmers were sitting down with their bankers and having conversations they had hoped never to have. Réal was at the kitchen table when Marlène showed him the numbers. He had the blue ledger book open in front of him, and she put the red notebook down beside it. He looked at both of them for a long time without saying anything, the ledger and the notebook. 65 years of farming this family had done between those 2 books. Then he said, "You were right." He did not say it quietly. He said it the way a man says something he has known for a while and has been gathering the honesty to say out loud. He said, "You were right 2 years before I gave you the East Quarter, and I should have listened instead of making you prove it on the worst ground we've got." Marlène said, "The East Quarter is why we have 3 years of data instead of 1. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "That's not what I mean." Her son, who was 19 and had been working the harvest that fall, was sitting at the other end of the table pretending to read a parts catalog. He was not reading the parts catalog. Let me tell you about the November afternoon when Gervais Tanguay drove into the Bouchard yard, because that is the moment this story has been building toward since that Saturday morning at the co-op. He came in his truck, a dark green Dodge 3500 with a custom sprayer on the flat deck, and he parked in the gravel beside the equipment shed and walked to where Marlène was checking the cedar bearings in preparation for winter storage. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He was not a man who found this kind of thing easy. Anyone could see that. "Marlène," he said, "you got a few minutes?" She looked up from the cedar. "Sure, Gervais." He came inside and stood with his hands in the front pocket of his canvas jacket and looked at the equipment and then at the floor. He said, "I've been hearing things about your East Quarter, about what it did this summer compared to the rest of the county. What have you been hearing? That you got 34 bushels, that the county averaged 24. "That's right." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got 17 customers who are looking at their numbers from this season and asking me what they should do differently, and I told them I'd ask around." He stopped. He looked at the cedar. He said, "I was hoping you could explain the program to me, how the interseeding works, what the timing looks like, what the cost structure is, what you do differently on different soil types." Marlène set down her wrench. She looked at Gervais Tanguay. She had spent 3 years doing this work quietly, without advertisement, while the county went about its business. She had driven past the co-op every week. She had bought her seed at the elevator 3 towns over, because it was easier than explaining herself. She had not said a word about the East Quarter results to anyone who had not specifically asked, and this man had stood in front of half the grain farmers in the county and turned her into a punchline. She did not say any of that. She said, "Gervais, do you remember what you said to me at the co-op in April of 2003 when I was picking up the pH meter?" He had the decency to go still. "I remember," he said. "You called it a salad mix. You said it's what the East Quarter deserved." She said it without heat, the way you read a field note back to someone, just the fact of it, stated plainly. "I know," he said. "I'm not bringing it up to make you feel bad," she said. "I'm bringing it up because the point isn't that cover crops are magic. The point is that any farm built entirely on synthetic inputs and annual tillage is a farm with no buffer, no stored water, no biological nitrogen, no resilience. And the summer of 2005 was not an unusual summer for this province, Gervais. It was a preview. The climate data from Agriculture Canada for this region shows a trend toward exactly this: more dry Julies, not fewer. And every farm in this county that is sitting at 1.9% organic matter on heavy clay is not a farm with a bad year problem. It's a farm with a structural problem." She picked up her wrench. "I'll put the whole program together in writing and get it to you. Bring whoever you want out here in the spring and we'll walk the fields. I'll show you the infiltration numbers, the soil tests, the cost per acre inputs side by side." Gervais nodded. He said, "I'd appreciate that." He stood there another moment. Then he put on his cap and walked back to the truck. Marlène watched him go. Then she went back to the cedar bearings. Let me tell you about what happened in the years that followed, because the story does not end in November of 2005. By 2008, 11 farms in the Lac-Saint-Jean region had adopted some version of the cover crop interseeding program that Marlène had developed on the Bouchard ground. By 2011, that number was 29. The results were not identical to what the Bouchard farm had achieved. Cover cropping on heavy clay is not a formula. It is a practice. It requires reading the soil, adjusting the timing, choosing the species mix for the specific conditions of each field, and having the patience to wait 2 and 3 seasons for the organic matter to move in a direction you can measure. But the trend held. Organic matter was climbing. Input costs were falling. Water infiltration was improving. And in the dry years of 2010 and 2012, the farms with established cover crop programs were outperforming their neighbors by margins that were no longer attributable to luck or good drainage. Marlène finished the coursework for her master's degree, which she had put on hold when her marriage ended, completing it part-time over 4 years while running the farm's agronomy program. Her thesis advisor at Laval, a soil scientist named Dr. François Mercier, who had been skeptical of her methodology when she first approached him, wrote in his evaluation that her field data from the Bouchard farm represented some of the most practically rigorous documentation of cover crop integration in short-season heavy clay systems that he had encountered in 20 years of reviewing agricultural research. In 2009, she was asked to present at the Symposium sur les grandes cultures in Quebec City. She was 53 years old, and she stood at a podium in front of 350 agronomists and grain farmers and extension agents, and she put up 6 years of yield data, 6 years of soil tests, 6 years of input cost records from the Bouchard farm, and she walked through the biology the way Dr. Mercier had refined her understanding of it, and at the end she said what she had said to Gervais Tanguay in the equipment shed, that any farm built entirely on synthetic inputs has no stored capacity, no biological buffer against the years when the rainfall doesn't come, and that the climate projections for the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region are not hypothetical. The dry Julies are coming more frequently. The spring moisture deficits are deepening. The farms that will still be farming in 20 years are the farms that are building soil now, while there is still time. Réal Bouchard was in the second row. He was 74 years old, and he had driven 3 hours from Dolbeau-Mistassini and sat through 2 other presentations he had found largely incomprehensible before Marlène's, and he had the blue ledger book in his jacket pocket the way he always did, even now, even here. When she finished, he stood up. He was not the kind of man who stood up at things. The people around him looked at him, and then a few of them stood, and then most of the room was on its feet. Marlène looked out from the podium and saw her father standing in the second row, not clapping dramatically, just standing, with his hands at his sides, looking at her the way a man looks at something he has been part of without fully understanding it, and has now, for the first time, seen from the outside. She understood what it meant. Let me tell you about one last thing, because it is the part of this story that matters most. In the spring of 2016, Marlène's son Sébastien was 30 years old and had been farming the Bouchard ground full-time for 4 years. He had grown up with a cover crop program the way his grandfather had grown up with synthetic nitrogen. It was simply what the farm did, not a philosophy, a practice. The way the Mistassini ran, not a decision but a fact. And in the spring of 2016, Sébastien came to his mother with a printout he had found through an online forum for young Canadian grain farmers. A producer in Saskatchewan who was running a fully integrated no-till system with a 12-species cover crop cocktail, biological inoculants, targeted grazing using rented sheep during the cover crop window, reducing external inputs to a fraction of the county average while producing yields that had climbed every year for 8 years. The numbers in the printout were not modest numbers. Sébastien put the paper on the kitchen table and said, "I want to try something." Marlène looked at the printout. She looked at her son. She did not say she needed to think about it. She did not suggest he start with the East Quarter to keep the risk contained. She said, "Which fields do you want to start with?" That is what the red notebook was for. Not only to document what worked, but to remember what it felt like when nobody believed it would, and to make sure that the next time someone walked into the kitchen with a new idea, the answer came faster. The Bouchard farm is still there, east of the Mistassini River. 520 acres of gray clay loam that has been in the same family for nearly 90 years. The organic matter in those fields now measures above 3.8% in most of the cultivated area, a number that soil scientists from the IRDA describe as exceptional for continuous grain production on heavy clay in a short-season northern climate. The synthetic nitrogen applications that Marlène Bouchard was running at 120 pounds per acre in 2003 have been reduced to an average of 45 pounds across the operation. The water infiltration rates that Marlène first measured with a borrowed double-ring infiltrometer are now part of a formal soil health reference case maintained by the Quebec Ministry of Agriculture for the Lac-Saint-Jean region. Gervais Tanguay retired in 2014. He came to the Bouchard farm one last time before he left the county, and he stood at the edge of the East Quarter, the original 130 acres where everything had started, and he looked at the soil structure exposed in a tire rut from the harvest equipment, and he said, "I should have listened to you in 2003. Marlène told him that the 17 farmers he had sent to her in 2006 and 2007 had built enough organic matter by 2010 to carry their crops through the dry summer of that year without the losses the rest of the county took. That what mattered was that they had learned it while there was still time to act on it. He seemed to find some comfort in that. The red field notebook and the blue ledger book are both in the kitchen drawer beside the telephone. Both of them are full. Réal's handwriting is in the ledger. Marlène's is in the notebook. Sébastien has started a new notebook, a black one, thicker. She interseeded cover crops in a canola county. They called it a salad mix. The drought came. The county's yields collapsed. The Bouchard ground held.